Hello, my name is Jermaine Reese, and I teach criminal justice in the School of Workforce Development here at Grand Rapids Community College. Tonight, I have the distinguished privilege to interview and speak with tonight's diversity lecturer, Benjamin Jealous, Senior Fellow with the Center for American Progress, former CEO and President of the NAACP, journalist, author of the book entitled Reach, as well as social activist. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
If we begin our conversation, I'd like to start with one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King, which is simply, "An injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere."
Oh, absolutely.
You were one of the youngest CEO and president for a very historic social action organization, and took over at a time that was quite dismal,
Yep.
but we're still able to make some very beneficial changes. Can you talk about your road, your journey to social activism, which ultimately led to you being the president of the NAACP?
You know, I started out in college, and I didn't frankly plan on being an activist when I showed up to college. I had two heroes as a teenager. One, of course, was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The other was a character on a show called Family Ties. His name was Alex P. Keaton, played by Michael J. Fox.
Yes.
And Alex P. Keaton was a young, aspiring stock trader and investor. And my grandmother had given me $10,000 to invest for college, and I invested in stocks and done very well. So I went to Columbia University thinking I'll head to Wall Street. Well, I showed up at college and realized that the type of economics they were teaching were so exploitative. I didn't want any part of it. Mm-hmm. And I happened to show up to the Ivy League University that's in Harlem. And what really impacted me the most was just the absolute poverty that people were living in maybe a quarter mile from campus. And I became an organizer, ultimately for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, working on issues of social exclusion, lack of access to health care, and ultimately criminal justice issues. My generation is the first generation in the mass incarceration era. Mass incarceration starts taking off. The sort of law and order period starts in 1968, the same year that Dr. King was assassinated. Mm-hmm. And it just climbs steadily ever since. At the same time, what you see happen is that investment in public higher education begins to decrease. Literally, the prison system eats the lunch of the public higher education system. And you get to a point where if you sit with, for instance, the former president of Penn State University, as I did when he was president of Penn State 5 years ago, you said, what's your big leadership challenge? So it's the same every year. I go up to the state capitol, try to keep so much more money from going to the state pen, so just a little more can come to Penn State. When you deal with fights like we've had in California, where I grew up, where when I was a child, 3% of the state budget went to prisons and 11% went to public universities. The public universities were almost free and among the best in the world. And by the time I'd been at the NAACP for a few years, they had fallen in California to 7% for public universities, gone to 11% for prisons. And the governor was proposing 15% for prisons and 6% for universities. Which is to say that we love our kids a lot, because our funding of public higher education has never fallen as low as it once was for prisons. But there's something that trumps our love for our own children, and it's our fear of somebody else's kids.
Yes. And that brings an interesting point, because just recently, President Obama has spoken and talking about initiatives to support funding for two-year colleges and vocational training.
Yep.
And yet another one of his ideas that has been met with great adversity. How beneficial was something as simple as a two-year education or vocational training? How would that affect and impact society when we're looking at mass incarceration issues, when we're talking about creating a workforce community to sustain our country?
Look, one of the great ironies of our country is you can go state to state, Georgia, New York State, it doesn't matter. There's a shortage of truck drivers. There's a shortage of welders. And there's a surplus of young men who can't find jobs. And there's virtually no young man that you cannot train to become a welder or a truck driver. They are skilled trades, but they're very accessible. President Obama's saying is we need to make it much easier for people to get into those trades. One of the mistakes we made a generation ago is we took a lot of trades out of the high schools and put them in community college, which means that you didn't get the chance to learn the trade until you graduated from high school. It turns out a lot, like 20, 30, 40% of all high school students are more likely to stay in high school if they have access to trades. It gives them a sense of self-esteem. It's something that they can excel at. They might not be excelling at calculus, but they can excel at welding. Well, if you say that you got to get through, geometry or trigonometry in high school to even get a chance to hold a blowtorch, you lose a lot of kids. One of the reasons why that's important from a mass incarceration perspective is it puts financial pressure on the states to get their priorities back in balance. So they're frankly driven by our love for our children, because they're all our kids, rather than our fear of quote unquote somebody else's kids, which only really works if you indulge in stereotypes. Because those troubled kids are our kids. And many of them would do better if there weren't so many obstacles to getting a good education.
I've often been asked in my former career, what was one of the most difficult things to deal with.
Yep.
You speak about the obstacles and the barriers that some young folks have. A portion of my career spent working in a high school and seeing some of the challenges that young folks have just to get to the school.
Yeah.
And then we expect them to still function at the rate as other folks that don't have these issues.
Yeah.
How can we better equip or better prepare or deal with those obstacles to even help this millennial population even to get through the high school? So even if we were to have free education, so what are some things or ideas or ways that we can combat that, or just getting them over those initial obstacles?
First, it really starts at home and what families do. Parents have to read to their children.
Sure.
And if there are real structural barriers to that, you could have a parent who themselves is illiterate. You could have a parent who has 5 kids and they have nobody else to help them take care of them, and the little one's getting neglected. Then turn on public radio or even turn on the television. There's a thing known as the word gap. And it literally just comes down to how many words does a child hear. And in the average poor household versus the average wealthy household, children hear far fewer words. And it really impacts language development. The next thing is, you make sure your kids hear the words. It's best if you read to them, but just again, even public radio will help, because they talk all the time. They talk in big words. The next thing is we have to be absolutely focused on making sure that every kid gets access to a quality education. We have this thing in our country we call the achievement gap. We talk about it racially. Black kids perform typically the worst, white or Asian kids the best, depending on the school district. Turns out, again, black folks, we are more likely to be clustered in poverty. 80% of the so-called achievement gap is a resource gap. Now, about 20% can be explained by the sort of parenting I'm talking about and the need for reading, but the other 80%, half of that solid 40% is the maldistribution of teachers. Other half is books and computers. But this is sort of the ironic thing. Talk about public institutions. If you go into a public hospital and you have a bullet wound to the head, you get better trained doctors, more attention, and at the end of the day, more money is spent on you than the guy who walks in with a skinned knee. Now, if you walk into a school with the intellectual equivalents, you're somebody who is, in the 7th grade and illiterate, versus somebody you're in the 7th grade and you're reading at like a 6th grade reading level. We'll spend more attention in most schools on the kid we can get from the 6th grade to the 7th grade than the kid that we need to take from the 1st grade to the 7th grade. And yet, as an investor, and that's what I do these days, as an investor, one of the things you learn is that the quickest way to increase the value of your overall portfolio is to invest in the undercapitalized stocks, to invest in the companies that if they just invest more money in them would grow very rapidly. And so it is with our kids. If we just invest time in the kids who are struggling the most, our country will improve overall. And just one last thing on that. U.S. and Singapore Singapore is often first in the world in K through 12 achievement. We used to be first. We're now like 29th, 26th, depending on the category. I once asked a member of a Singaporean government delegation how they did it. They said two things. One, they said, we sent a bunch of folks to Harvard University, and when they came back to Singapore, we just did what they said. And then he kind of joked, said, y'all should try that sometime. Right. Well, we have 16,000 school districts, so you have to do that 16,000 times, and then we have very raucous politics, and so that's tough. But then the other thing he said was this. He said, the difference between you and us, you can't see it with the rich kids. The rich kids in Singapore, the rich kids in the U.S., they perform about the same. But the gap between how our rich kids perform in Singapore and how our poor kids perform is 4 times smaller than it is in the U.S. He said, you guys may think you have a race problem, you may think you have a resource problem. He said, what you have is a class problem. In your country, you devalue poor children, and the moment you stop doing that, you'll get back to being first in the world again. I think he's right.
Yeah. So let's take a journey back for a moment.
Sure.
You mentioned Columbia.
Yeah.
In your book, you mentioned when I asked what led to your spark, or what led to that passion, and you talked about financial aid.
Yeah, and getting kicked out of school.
And getting kicked out. Talk about that. How significant was that in the formation of the Ben that we see now?
I mean, look, here's the reality. If I had not been kicked out of school, I would not have become a Rhodes Scholar, because it gave me a gap to really assess what was important to me. And in that gap, I decided I wanted to come back and be competitive at the very highest level of academia. So I would have opportunities to go to Yale Law School or to be a Rhodes Scholar and ultimately break through to a place of greater political power for black people and for working class families in this country. But it also, taking that risk, deciding that I was going to stand up and fight for students like me who were just like a year or two behind me against a university that was prepared to end full need financial aid or need blind admissions, that either would have resulted in what they call an admit-deny situation. We admit you to the school, we deny you to financial aid.
Sure.
So then you have to choose between going into like hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt or not being able to go to that school. Or a situation where we simply make class a formal part of the admissions process, like it was at Harvard University, in like 1650, right? And take our country way back. And so we stood up, we fought, we won. The school preserved its full need financial aid program, but the next protest we organized, they threw all the principal organizers out of school. And the irony was the way to save the program was that one of the beneficiaries of the program from the 1930s had become the richest man in the world. His name was John Kluge, and he wrote it. So you would think that itself would have affirmed why they should keep doing this, right? It pays big dividends. But there you go. For me, I did a couple of things. One, I took a guy who was kind of a middling student, took him out of college for a couple of years to go find himself. That paid off, like I talked about, the Rhodes Scholarship. Two, baby boomers are fairly narcissistic as a generation, in my experience, and we were the first ones kicked out of Columbia since the baby boomers of students for a democratic society and other groups, and so they called right away because they were now in their 40s and their 50s and said, "Wow, you must be a genius. You're the first one kicked out since I was kicked out," and they began offering me jobs. As an organizer. And one of those I took, it was with the AFL-CIO, and it ultimately led me to Mississippi. And I was blessed because places like Mississippi have had such a brain drain. There's more black doctors in Los Angeles County, at least as of the mid-1990s when I was there, than there were more black doctors from Mississippi in Los Angeles County, California, than there were black doctors from Mississippi in all of Mississippi.
Wow.
That you ended up with a bunch of old black civil rights heroes, like Dr. Aaron Henry, for instance, who led the NAACP in Mississippi from the 40s to the 90s, with very few people to teach and to train. And I was able to benefit from that, and it made a world of difference in my life.
So let's get right into the topic that you're going to be talking about tonight. And we've discussed some issues. You state that reforming our nation's criminal justice system is one of the most urgent civil rights issues of our time, and that there are more African American males, entangled in our criminal justice system than were enslaved in 1850.
Sure.
What led or pushed your passion to join this fight when we're talking about mass incarceration? We have folks like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who wrote an extensive article.
Michelle Alexander. Van Jones.
Yes.
We're all approximately the same age. We all were born in the end of the 60s, so the late 60s to the early 70s. And we all grew up in this generation that frankly watched things fall apart as we grew up. We saw communities like where my family's from in West Baltimore go from tough streets, but still places where people could feel safe, to absolute war zones. And people like my godbrother, my godfather's son, Dave Chappelle, responded with a very biting sense of humor. For those of us who weren't so talented, we developed a certain politic that said, we're going to stop this because we're seeing our friends get killed because our approach to the war on drugs is ineffective.
Sure.
We're seeing friends get sent to jail who were simply addicts. And we're seeing children get raised in foster care who should be raised by parents as a result. And so all of us have been in conversation one way or the other for a long time. The only question is it like 5 or 6 years like it is with me and Ta-Nehisi, or is it 20 years like with me and Van, or 10 years with Michelle and I? And, for me, I'll talk tonight about the night that I decided to fight. And I was 21 years old. I'd been at a friend's 21st birthday party, and somebody had toasted the fact that one more young black man had survived to 21. And it caused me many sleepless nights. This notion that in this country, the world's wealthiest democracy, a place of so much sort of seems like infinite hope, somebody could have their hopes for any group, let alone their own group, let alone my own group, so reduced that they thought it was just an accomplishment to breathe past your 21st birthday. I took it to my grandmother. She's now 99. At the time, I guess she was in her 70s. Granddaughter of slaves. Activist in the NAACP, and probably third or fourth generation civil rights activist. Her family had been civil rights activists even before the end of slavery, and abolitionists. And said, "What happened?" And she said, "Well, grandson, it's sad, but it's simple. Our people got what they fought for, but they lost what they had. They got the right to live anywhere in town, lost the right to live in a safe community, got the right to send their kids any school they wanted to, lost the right to assume their kids would be loved and cared for, whatever school they went to," and on and on. And what she was talking about was two things. One is the danger of taking anything for granted. We were taking our voting rights for granted, and all of a sudden they began to attack those. But the other was the importance of knowing what you're fighting for and what you have. And she was concerned that my generation hadn't figured out either. We took a lot of things for granted, didn't understand the prices that had been paid. But we also, and she would take some responsibility for this, had been raised to think that fighting was optional and hadn't questioned that assumption. And that night I decided to question that assumption, and I ultimately decided by the end of that evening that what I would focus on was ending injustice in the justice system. I had no idea how I was going to do that. But it at least gave me something to focus on to the exclusion of other things. And I've spent most of my life consistently going after the death penalty, going after mass incarceration, going after the sentencing of children to life without the possibility of parole. We've won many other fights. We've abolished the juvenile death penalty. Activists I've worked with and I actually founded the campaign. An activist I trained when she was 16 finished it before she was 25. President of the NAACP, we passed 50 criminal justice reform bills in Texas. Texas had never shut down a prison in its history. It's now on track to shut down 11. We abolished the death penalty, not just in 6 states, but the first time below the Mason-Dixon in Maryland. And we were able to get several wrongfully incarcerated people out of prison, including the Scott sisters. So, there was something in the water with our generation, and unfortunately, it was what feels like the wholesale destruction of a good piece of it.
How much of that, often when I have conversations, especially with folks younger than myself,
Sure.
And we're probably the same age, how much has been lost from our generation to the next as far as the importance of social activism and fighting for the common man's rights? How much of it, because I feel personally responsible that we took so much, as you stated, we took a lot for granted. We were pursuing academic degrees and careers and families, and somehow this other generation that's supposed to now be developing to be the future leaders, they have no idea of what our the predecessors had to endure or had to go through and experience. How big a factor is that when you're talking about keeping that hope, that source of or just that basic driving force for the human nature? Because once we lose hope, and we see it often, I mean, time and time again in the inner city, where you look into the eyes of a young African-American male and he's got no hope because everything around him is just blight. You've got death, destruction, torn down buildings, and it's hard to hope beyond that. So how much responsibility does our generation have to shoulder for not passing down those messages?
You know, look, the reality is that both for our generation and the ones coming after us, there's a lot of things I'm prepared to say are not our fault. Our parents, they're into the 60s, early the 70s, sort of drunk with this notion of achievement, having destroyed segregation. And it wasn't our fault that they said, just keep your nose clean and walk a straight line. You don't need to be protesting anything. Just go, frankly, reap what we have sown. But it's only our responsibility one day to wake up and say, wait a second, I'm a parent myself now. And this world has turned out a lot worse than my parents thought it would. And now I've got to start over and be part of getting our generation re-engaged and training the next generation coming after us. And it's not our fault that a lot of the great leaders who we could have learned from in our 20s have since died, and we can't learn from them. But it's only our responsibility to figure out how you reassemble that knowledge and you pass it on. What our community had learned, we're very young in many ways as far as participation in democracy, but we're not as young as we feel. We want to say, essentially, look, we didn't get voting rights until the mid-1960s. But the reality is, in places like this, blacks were voting before the Voting Rights Act. We secured it at the state level. And there were people, like a good friend of mine's father in Western Pennsylvania, who had perfected power. He had a group called the Negro Social and Political Club of Donora, Pennsylvania. And this was a steel worker with a third grade education. He was president of the Negro Social and Political Club, steel worker. He took care of two things at once. One was he desegregated the restaurants of Donora by himself with a pistol. It was a company town. It was a steel town. And lots of steel workers carried guns, as some steel workers do this day, to protect themselves. The shifts change around the clock. The shift runs, if you will, from 8 to 4, and one from 4 to midnight, and one from midnight to 8 a.m. So you had two shifts changing at midnight. And they would carry Saturday night specials typically to protect themselves. And the ethic of the time is similar to what people have made in places like Texas today, which is that if you're going to carry a firearm, you have to let it be known. And so you would go into a restaurant, you'd set the gun down on the table, and you'd order, and then you'd pick it up, put it in your pocket, you walk home. Well, in a company town, people can lose their jobs for taking part in desegregation protests. So they adapted to the town. And they said, but nobody's going to fire us for a celebration. So the president of the club would walk in, they would ignore him. He'd put his gun on the table. They would serve him. Now the first black person has been served in that restaurant. Then he would go back to his club secretary, wake her up, either at 8 a.m. or at 1 o'clock in the morning, and say, now you got to call everybody and tell them that today they got to go eat at Joe's Diner. There's a celebration. It's been desegregated. In all actuality, it hadn't been desegregated when one black man ate there. But by the time 50 black folks showed up to eat there, the tea was done. But, and so, if you will, there was sort of a real intelligence and kind of a judo that the folks figured out, this is how you build power. The same guy is credited ultimately with electing the first countywide black officials in that county. But before he did that, he would go to white judges who were being soft on people who were involved in lynch mob violence and say to them, this is how many votes you got from our community last year, and this is how much you won by. You'll notice the second number is smaller than the top number. So just to be really clear, we cannot elect whoever we want yet, but we can unelect whoever we want.
Sure.
And the question you need to ask is whether you want to keep your job. Those sorts of lessons in power, a lot of them have been lost. And so one of the things we have to do is, quite frankly, spend a lot of time reteaching ourselves and then helping to train the generations coming behind us in the art of real power and power that's focused on real results for people who need a champion.
All right. So we've got a few more minutes left.
Sure.
I'm very interested to hear what you're going to say tonight. And close us out with this thought. In the article that Ta-Nehisi Coates that he wrote, he's 1 in 4 black men born in the late 70s have spent time in prison. How do we combat, or how do we change 5 decades of practices in legislature and policies that have been predicated upon unwarranted fear?
You change them aggressively and all at once. And quite frankly, in this battle, our biggest obstacle are moderates. The activists in both parties agree. Activist Democrats, activist Republicans. But the moderates are afraid. They're afraid of being called soft on crime. What you've seen, quite frankly, is governors like Rick Perry in Texas and governors like Governor Deal in Georgia, both Republicans and very conservative ones, be willing to go further, faster in reforming criminal justice in their states than for instance, Jerry Brown in California, the old moderate Democrat. And these are not times for kind of moderation in the face of extreme injustice. And so the way you do that, again, is you build consensus on both sides and you squeeze the middle. And you push as quickly as possible. Places like Georgia, the way they did it, frankly, what Governor Deal did is what a Democratic Senator, Jim Webb, had proposed we do under Obama, but it was impossible to do even those first 2 years when Democrats controlled both houses, which was a wholesale review of the entire criminal code and a resetting of it.
Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate this moment that we've had to talk. I greatly look forward to the continuation of your discussion involving mass incarceration this evening. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate you.
Thank you.